This is Twilight Struggle. As you can see here, we see the world. Europe. The world map is divided into regions. Europe, Middle East, Africa, Asia over here, South America, Central America, and various countries are represented by these rectangles. One space designed for the US influence, one space designed for the USSR influence. Some of the labels you see have yellow labels, some of them have purple labels. The purple labeled countries are considered battlegrounds, meaning they bring the world one step closer to global thermonuclear war. The yellow spaces are non-battlegrounds, and conflict in those countries does not necessarily bring the world closer to global thermonuclear war. Influence in different countries is represented by counters. You can see here we've got a pile of Soviet influence, a pile of American influence over here. Up here at the top, I have a turn track. There's 10 turns. Each turn represents about 3 to 5 years. Down here we see the space race track, which tracks both superpowers' journey to the moon, with various benefits. Well, you get the idea. Various benefits. There we go. As we go along. Down here we have a track that tracks the amount of military operations both sides initiate or participate in. Each turn we're required to conduct a certain number of military operations or take a penalty in victory points. The number of required military operations is dictated by the Defcon Status. Military operations in the purple labeled battleground countries will cause the Defcon Status to decrease by 1, which further, as you see down here, restricts the regions which coups or realignments can be conducted in, which both count as operations. More on that in a bit. We'll get there. VP victory point track. We see the track goes from 20 USSR victory points to 20 American victory points. If at any point one of the superpowers reaches 20 victory points, they win. Oh, what else? The game is card driven. See here we've got there's a shared deck. Currently the deck only contains the early war cards. As the war progresses, we will add in the mid-war and late war cards, which, I mean, add various operations and whatnot into the game. Look at an example card here. This video is meant to be a run through of the game, which is going to simulate kind of what a typical game will look like. The digital edition of Twilight Struggle is due out here in the next month or so, and so I'd like to have as many people know about the game, kind of get a feel for what's happening as much as possible. Let's look at a typical card right quick. Well, the first thing that's going to happen is we're going to deal 8 cards to each player. There's one special card, the China card, which begins play face up in front of the USSR player. The China card abstracts China's role in the Cold War, as the China card will actually flip-flop from side to side as the game goes on, after it's used by that player. Well, I'm going to use the China card as an example. We see the title of the card, some event that can take place if the card is played for that. Cards can be played in one of two ways, either for the event, in order to implement the text on the card, or as operations, where we're going to look at the top number here, in this case 4. Ops can be used to place additional influence on the map adjacent to where you already have it. So like I could play this 4 card to put 4 points in Angola if I were so inclined. I could not, however, put it in Zaire, because I don't have anything adjacent to Zaire or any influence in an adjacent country. Influence can only be added to countries adjacent to countries that already have U.S. influence, and well, the USSR, the influence would have to have been there at the beginning of the turn. So you cannot leapfrog 1, 2, 3, 4 points. It has to be all in adjacent countries. Another way you could do this, you could play 4 points to conduct a military operation, namely a military coup, in a country that contains some opponent's influence. Typically, a good starting move for the USSR player would be to conduct a military coup of Iran there, because there's limited U.S. influence there, and it's quite an unstable country. The number in the corner, up here, top right corner, is the stability number. A higher stability number means it's harder to coup. It also means that's how much influence the opponent has to have before they control it. For example, I don't control, or the US player does not control Iran because they only have 1 point there. If they had 2, they would control it. And control means that we flip the tile over to the colored side. It also has a number of in-game effects, specifically with scoring, which we can get into later. Anyway, the military coup can be conducted. Like if I have 4 points here, I can conduct a military coup of Iran, meaning I'll roll my dice. I will add the 4 from the card, or whatever number is on the card. In this case, there's 6, plus 4 is 10. I look at the stability number, 2, double it to 4, and I subtract that from the number I rolled. So 10 minus 4 is 6. And in this specific case, I would remove 1 and add 5, meaning the USSR position got 6 better, if that makes sense. In that same instance, if the US used a 4 ops card to conduct a coup of Iraq, let's say we had 4 ops, roll the dice, there's 5. 5 plus 4 is 9. We look at the stability number is 3 is 6. 9 minus 6 is 3. The US position would get 3 better, meaning the USSR would lose that 1 influence and US would gain 2, meaning they got their position is 3 influence improved. The third way to conduct or to use points is to the 4 points is to conduct realignments, meaning both players roll against each other with modifiers for adjacent friendly controlled countries. The difference between the rolls is subtracted from that person's influence in that country. Meaning, if let's say we were conducting a coup as the U.S. player of Iraq, there is no bonuses here because no player has an adjacent controlled country. Adjacency is marked by those lines right there. So Iran, Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, and Jordan are all adjacent to Iraq. Let's say we were rolling here. US got 5, USSR got 3. The difference is 2. Because the US is higher, that means we subtract 2 influence from the USSR player. They only have 1. But the US wouldn't gain any. Influence can never be gained by way of a realignment. It can only be used to remove influence. Last way we can play a card is we can play it on the Space Race. Now, as a specific rule, the China card cannot be played on the Space Race, but any one of our other cards in our hand can. We look at the Space Race track up here, look at the number of ops that is required. In this case, for the first box, it would be 2 ops, meaning we need a card worth 2 or more. And we discard it, put it in the temporary discard pile. As always, we roll the dice. See, that's 2. That's good enough. We see the roll number there, 1 to 3. We got 2. That's good. The USSR would improve on the Space Race. The number separated by slash means the first person who gets to that box gets 2 VP. Second person who gets to that box scores 1 VP. And that would be reflected here on the track. But we're not doing that yet. As you can see, as we go up the Space Race track, various effects happen, or can happen. Opponent chooses and shows headline card first. We'll get to that. Discard a card, etc. China card is really meant to be used as a way to get rid of cards that you don't want in your hand. And it can even be problematic if you get too high on the Space Race. Because then, as you can see, as you go up, it requires higher ops cards, and you may not have those cards in your hand to sacrifice. As you can see, the board is already set up to begin play. Many of the countries have these numbers here, either red or blue in the corner here. This means that at the start of the game, the U.S. player has one influence there. To begin, the U.S. has 1 point in Panama, 1 point in South Africa, 1 point in Iran, 1 point in Israel, 5 points to give control of the UK, 2 points in Canada. Whoops, that's a mistake. As you can see, this ability number is 4. So 2 influence does not give control of Canada yet. US also has 1 point in Japan, 1 point in South Korea, 1 point in the Philippines, and control of Australia with 4 points. Australia is typically useless. It does count towards the U.S. Position in Asia, but typically that 4 influence stays there the whole game. USSR begins with control of East Germany with 3 points, 1 point in Finland, 1 point in Syria, 1 point in Iraq, control of North Korea, and that's all. We've required military operations and Defcon Status both begin at the leftmost edge at peace. VP starts at 0, turn marker starts at turn 1, Space Race begins at Earth. Another way to gain victory points, or the main way to gain victory points, I should say, is by play of scoring cards. In the early war, there are scoring cards for Asia, Middle East, and Europe, which means the first turn is typically spent shoring up our position in those 3 regions. Once the game progresses to mid-war, Africa and the Americas get shuffled into the mix, as well as a specific Southeast Asia scoring card. As you can see, Asia has some of these diagonal countries. Those countries are Southeast Asian countries, and various cards mention Southeast Asia specifically as a kind of a sub-region. Technically, Europe is the same way. The dark purple countries are Western European countries. The light purple countries are Eastern European countries. Likewise, there are certain cards that mention those sub-regions individually. Okay, let's take a look at our cards, because knowing the cards is really the crux of this game. And being aware of how to use different cards in different ways, or really the right way at the time, is the key to victory. So this will be the USSR hand here. 8 cards. We see here first Asia scoring. At this point, it doesn't necessarily behoove us to play it, unless we were worried that the U.S. would, through some manner of telepathy, I suppose, play into Asia very early on. One of the special rules about scoring cards we see here may not be held. At the end of the turn, we will both have 1 held card, or 1 card that we don't have to play. the scoring card cannot be one of those cards. If you accidentally hold a held card in tournament play, you've lost. If you hold it, you've lost. You've accidentally started global thermonuclear war, and the victory goes to the opponent. In tournament play, you'd have to reveal that you've your held card just to make sure that it's not a scoring card. But as it stands here, let's look at scoring right quick, just so we know. Scoring templates right here. Presence 3 points, domination 7 points, control 9 points. Presence mean you control one country in the region. Domination means you control more countries in the region than your opponent. You also control more battleground countries, and you at least control one battleground and one non-battleground. Control follows the, first of all, you must meet the conditions for domination, but you also must control all of the battlegrounds. At this stage, USSR has presence, as does the US with Australia. The USSR has one more battleground, but does not control any non-battlegrounds. And, yes, of course. You also gain 1 point per controlled battleground in the region. You also gain 1 point per controlled country that is adjacent to the enemy superpower. As the USSR right now, I'm looking at Japan as the only country that's adjacent to the US. As a general rule, the USSR almost never plays into Japan, for there's a card that gives it to the US for essentially free. So we don't want to do that. It's not important. But I do have one battleground that gives me 1 VP, and that's all I would get if I wanted to play the scoring card. I do have the China card. I start with the China card. The China card is a special card. Gives me 5 points in Asia. You see +1 ops when all points are used in Asia. And so it's technically worth 5 if I put it all in Asia. And so I could technically sweep in, take domination real fast, and play it for a quick strike in VP as the USSR. That's not a bad idea. That we may consider that. All right, de Gaulle leads France. Oh, I forgot to mention. The cards will have either be U.S. associated events or USSR associated events. Looks like we don't have any U.S. associated events, but they're there, trust me. Oh, there we go. U.S., USSR. If we play cards, like this is USSR card, I can choose to play it as the effect or ops. If I were to play the Truman Doctrine, however, I can really only, I would only conceivably ever play it for ops, because I get the 1 point, but the effect will always happen. If you play a card containing your opponent's associated events, the event occurs either before or after you get to pick, but the event will occur, so you got to be careful of that. Typically, a lot of the times, the points for an enemy associated event is used in order to mitigate the damage done by the effect, which will occur regardless. But anywho, de Gaulle leads France. Remove 2 U.S. influence in France. Add 1 USSR influence. So you can see France over here is empty for the moment, but there will be some initial setup, and it's possible the U.S. will play into France. Because of de Gaulle, most players won't play into France because they know it can be taken out. For us as a USSR right now, this is kind of a dead card, or not a dead card, but it's less useful because we're not removing that 2 US influence because they don't have any. We get 1 USSR influence, so it's worth 1 point at this stage, but it's also worth 3 points if I want to play it for a coup or realignments. So it's worth more to me now to play it as ops. Another thing, the asterisk here means this card gets played or removed from play permanently if the event activates. So if I, as the USSR, play it for ops, it gets played in the temporary discard pile because the event didn't trigger. Because if I play it my event for ops, the event doesn't have to trigger. The event can't trigger. Okay, so technically I'm not really so keen on playing that card first, but I will play it for ops. Truman Doctrine. Remove all USSR influence markers in 1 uncontrolled country in Europe. This is a U.S. associated event, a particularly nasty one. It can be, if the U.S. has it. It's really actually better for me to have it As you can see, there are no uncontrolled countries except for Finland and Canada. Removing influence from an empty country is useless. So I want to play this as soon as possible. Not only will I get the point, I will deny the card to the US, because the effect will happen. They won't have a target, but the effect still happens, just nothing comes of it, and it gets permanently discarded. So it's good in that respect.